Hi again, HIN 620 folks. We're going to go over a couple of exercises in the chapter 11 of how to create databases, tables, and indexes. So the first exercise is to create a script to add an index to the AP database for the zip code field in the vendors table. So first step we can do is create a new query tab. So that'll allow us to write the query in here. It's not always that you need to do this, but if you haven't previously told the system what database you're using, you're going to want to say use and then the database. In this case, it's AP. That just says, okay, I'm not going to type in any prefixes of the tables. I'm just going to assume that you know that we're dealing with the AP database, because otherwise you could, if you use the table from the AP database, let's say like terms or something like that, you could say, well, actually, like it did it here, about accidentally showing you a good example of it. It prefaces the name of the table with the database name, so EX. So basically, when you use the command use, it avoids having to preface it. So to create an index, let's start with, and I find myself, even after all these years of doing SQL stuff, Googling what's the syntax. So in general, the syntax is create an index with an index name on the table name and which column you're creating it on, and then you have optional ascending, descending. So let's get rid of that for now because we don't have any need to use it. So we'll create an index for the vendor zip code, and we'll call it vendor zip code IDX. It's good to put some sort of suffix on here on the index name so that you know it's an index. Some people use, the book uses IX. I've never seen that before, but I prefer to use IDX. But you can really use whatever you want to as long as you're consistent. And then the name of the table is vendors, and then the column is vendors zip code. Whoops, zip code, not zip cod. That would be a fish. So now we have the complete index command, and as you'll see here in the AP database on vendors, that index does not exist. So let's run this code. And you see down here, it used database, created the index, and now if we refresh this guy, there is the zip code right there. So that was exercise 1. Exercise 2 is to create the statements that will create the 3 tables shown in the diagram. So there are 2 ways to do this. I will show you the manual one first, which I assume is what they want you to do, and then I'll show you one that I like a lot better, but I don't honestly know if we're breaking any rules by showing it to you, but it seems easier, so why not? Once again, we'll start by opening a query window, query tab, and again, we're going to do the use command. So we're going to create these tables in the EX database, and then per the instructions, we're supposed to add the command for dropping the table if it exists. In other words, you're saying, look, I want to get rid of it, and I want to create this new one. Just make sure before you drop anything, a table, an index, anything that you want, that you definitely want to get rid of it, because it will go goodbye. So this is saying drop the table if it exists. And then, again, you're going to be searching for the syntax unless you somehow have it memorized. So you're going to create the table if it doesn't exist, which we've kind of already guaranteed at this point that it doesn't exist. But this is not a bad habit to get into, to create a table only if it exists. because basically if you try to create a table and it does exist, it will just give you errors. It's not really going to do anything bad. And then one by one, you put in the columns that you want, making sure to give it the data type and whether you want it to be not null or not. And for the primary key, if it's an ID, you definitely want to do the auto increment. So I'm just going to plop in here all these other columns. And then so once you've got the columns done, you want to then create the indices. And I think the book discussed that they'd rather do it this way within the table, which is fine. And that is pretty much it. Whoops, that's not a so the primary key is your member ID. The unique index is also the member ID because you want to make sure that that's not unique. That is unique. In the first and last name, you might think, oh, I should make that unique, but that's not really a good idea because if you have two people with the exact same first and last name, you still want them to be separate, or you wanted them both to be allowed to be in the database, so you don't really want to skip them on that one. And so if you run this command, you're going to create an empty table that satisfies this criteria. And so without going into depth in these other ones, I'll just paste them in here. So the groups is very similar. You have the auto increment, but also you have where the group ID is unique. Actually, this should be just like UI for unique index. And so that should be. And so you want the group name to be unique because it would kind of not make sense to have multiple groups with the same name. Okay, and now you have the member groups table, which has two simple columns, member ID and group ID, and has a unique index on both of them. And then you have the foreign keys. So the format for the foreign keys is to list them as constraints and say it's the foreign key is this ID and it references that column in this table. Again, I'm going to say this all the time. You're going to frequently be Googling, what the heck is that syntax for that thing? And so now that you have the, correct syntax to at least avoid any errors, you would see X's right next to the line numbers here if there were any explicit errors. Like if we, for example, get rid of this semicolon there, this is going to say, hey, there's an error there. That's an unknown command because you didn't end this properly. So anyway, if you were to run these commands, you would create the three tables in the EX database. So why don't we do that now? And there it goes. So whoops, it opens the AP database. So we have members, member groups, and groups. So now that you've seen it done that way, I can show you what I think is an easier way because I'm sort of a visual guy, and maybe it's not easier because it may actually qualify as a extra step. But what I did was I went over to the modeling thing, which is what I showed you in the last screencast, and I created the tables. So I created it in a visual way such that the groups table had the group ID and the group name, and the members, and so on and so forth. And then what I did was once I had all that set and everything the way I wanted it with all the indices I wanted, I did File, Export, and then this command forward engineer. So you forward engineer it, you choose a script file to save it to. So any file name is fine. And then I chose the options of generating the drop statements because that's what the assignment asked for, And then I said omit the schema qualifier because that seems to be consistent with this the book where they want you to do the use instead of putting the EX or AP in front of it. And then you can play around with all these other options here, and then you just kind of go through and say go for it, and then you end up with the scripts, these beautiful scripts. It has this extra stuff in here. I'm not really even sure what that's all about. Again, it might be playing with some of those options to get rid of it. So that's how to do it in two different ways. You can use either way you want to. I don't think either way is necessarily more right or more wrong than the other one, but I'll leave it up to you guys. And now I'll show you the part of exercise 3 where they insert data into the tables. The format, again, is something you can easily Google. It's insert into whatever the table is, then the list of columns, and then the values you want to put in there. So if we do all the insertions expected in the exercise, you inserted a couple of members, a couple of groups, and then the member group associations. And so I already ran that, and then what we can do when you want to see the data itself, you just right click on the table and say select rows, limit 1,000 or whatever you want to do, and you see that the data is actually in there now. Now that the data has been inserted into the tables, let's go look at the last part of question 3, exercise 3, which talks about selecting the data. Now I realize we haven't really gone over select commands or insert commands for that matter that are in previous chapters that we'll go back to. So for now I'll just give you an overview, and we'll probably hit more of this later. So the general idea of a select statement, and a select statement is really the most important statement you're going to have, is select which columns you want from which table or tables, and the where part is how you join the tables together. How you say this table refers to that table by this column. And one thing about the tables is you can use aliases, which I'll show you down here in my example. So just keep that in mind for a second. So let's get rid of that while we show you a specific example. So according to the directions, you want to get the group name, the member last name, member first name, and you want to join the 3 tables, members, groups, and members and groups. So when you do the list of tables here, you can alias them with one letter or multiple letters, whatever you want after it, so that it's easier in the where statement to say which one you're talking about, because otherwise you'll get errors about ambiguous commands. So basically what I said here was let's join the members table M, groups table G, and members groups table MG. And where the member ID in the members table equals the member ID in the member group table. So by prefacing this was mg.memberid versus m.memberid, that is telling the difference between those two member IDs, that they come from different tables. And I want the group ID to be the member group ID. So that's how I join the tables, and when we run this command, we get the tables, the information that we're looking for, the name of the group, the last name, first name, and for both of those. So again, that might be a little bit far ahead for now, but let's just kind of see if we can understand it from this level. And if anybody has any questions, just let me know, and I'll be sure to answer you. Have a great day.